Добрий день. Щирі вітання з Варшави. I'm sorry to speak English today, but I'm not sure that my Ukrainian is good enough to talk about such a wide range of topics at the moment. Therefore, I would rather use English so we do not have to choose between any other languages that I may speak that may be tricky for any kind of reason. Now, as for the question, who am I? I am Olgierd Ozembło. I'm a language lecturer and a linguist from Warsaw University. My specialty is Chinese, but also some other languages. And I'm specializing in visual semiotics and grapholinguistics. Therefore, I'm also interested in propaganda tools, especially online propaganda with visual means. At the moment, I'm a researcher with the Warsaw Sign and Symbol Research Group, but also I work simply as a language teacher at the Warsaw University. Now, my interest in China kind of started with my parents. My parents used to be diplomats. They traveled in post-Soviet, or at that time actually, Soviet sphere of influence, Mongolia, China, but also I remember myself being to Ukraine as a kid, and my father was posted as a diplomat to Mongolia, to Ukraine in his later years, and therefore the whole circle of those countries lies within my interest, especially that languages are not foreign to me, and I do extensive reading in all of the languages of the area that are available to me. And I think Chinese when I was a kid was most difficult for me. Therefore, treating it as a challenge, I decided to concentrate on Chinese, and it somehow defined my life. Well, the questions you are asking are so they dated so quickly. I must say that right now, at the modern situation, more nowadays situation, the whole thing is very, very complicated. Since I'm a linguist, I would rather prefer to speak about the narrative and discourse and different ways of showing the same problem depending on our point of view, very often depending on culture and so on. Now, if we look at the triangle between Russia, China, and Ukraine, or I would even say Russia, China, and USA and Ukraine, the interplay is very interesting, and the interplay is rather independent of the recent visit of Xi Jinping or any other interactions that are happening now. We have to see that for all those countries we have a kind of stable discourse and narrative that keeps on reappearing, especially in Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China, where the one-man grasp of the policies definitely traveling through the society, especially via the media and social media. This seems to be a very common topic in those two countries. Whereas in USA it does change a lot, especially with the recent change of the presidency and really sometimes unexpected moves that are happening in the US. With the tariffs and the China-American conflict suddenly being much hotter, at the same time with the USA appearing much weaker than before. I don't know. Again, as a linguist, I'm interested in how discourse is presented, what vocabulary is used, how the warring factions or countries are trying to vie for to fight for the attention of the average internet user in their own countries, and also for the public opinion of the West, of the East, of the developing countries, of the Great North and Great South. For me, the stable points within Russian narrative is being friends with China, being good friends in China with China, and there is nothing fishy going on with China, and well, of course, America is the great evil that is trying to destroy the post-Soviet sphere of influence, because the sphere of influence is something that Russia defines itself as the center of the sphere of influence that shall not be destroyed by the US, and that's this way it is presented in Russian media. From Chinese standpoint, and the way it is presented, again, this is a similar point to Russian talking point. The bad and great evil is, of course, USA, and that seems to be a common theme. USA using helpless and volatile Ukraine that is led by some people that are plotting against their own nation, but that's more Russian narration. In China, it's just helpless and hapless Ukraine being used by USA in order to undermine Russian sphere of influence. And again, Russia is the powerful country, one of the superpowers, should have its own sphere of influence, and any agency that smaller countries may have, it's countermanded very quickly with a narrative by the term that is often used to our country, to Ukraine, and other nations of Eastern Europe. Those are 小国家, little countries. Little countries should not have that much to say, and little countries should listen to the big countries that can define their future, that are important for their future, and that are the only hope for those little countries, as if the big country is some kind of mythical Obi-Wan Kenobi that is our only hope. Well, that is not our Obi-Wan Kenobi. Those countries seem to be more like Darth Vader and Count Dooku, whatever that means. Anyway, within that triangle, the stable narration is again that China, from Chinese point of view, that China is trying to keep the world peace, that is actual peace agent, and is going to, and it is helping to achieve some kind of status quo that will be acceptable for both sides, totally disregarding the actual national interests of the smaller countries, and only taking care and taking into consideration the bigger countries' interests. And the stability should be achieved by sacrifices by smaller countries to the bigger countries. Well, you may ask me, that question you didn't ask, but you may ask me, like, what is the basic difference? Well, I think the basic difference in those two Chinese and Russian narratives is probably the attitude toward the war, and China also toward the war, especially in a nuclear sense, because that is something that China really does not want, and it rarely appears in the official media, and maybe more often it will appear on social media, but it is also not strengthened nor in any way encouraged, at least from what I am seeing. So that would be very different from the narrative that we see in Russian central media, which, by the central TV channels and so centrally controlled social media, the nuclear war and nuclear threat is constantly reappearing topic. What is interesting is the way that America presents itself, since we have a very strong division not only between the Democratic and Republican media, but also within the so-called conservative media that are taking over the so-called mainstream right now. Because you've got parts of that media trying to underplay the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in order to strengthen the pressing power against China. At the same time, we see President Trump, I guess, not really playing that hand that strongly, especially with the whole tariff war. So there is very, very unequivocal, actually plurivocal way of presenting narrative of the right side of the American political scene, where it is sometimes very difficult to actually find which is the official narrative of Washington at the moment. It's not the same with Chinese or Russian side, because Chinese and Russian side are much more controlled by the central authorities, and actually probably unilaterally by one person, be it Xi Jinping or Putin. I think that what is happening between China and Russia at the moment, it's as it is presented usually to foreign listeners, it's China and Russia are friends. China and Russia are eternal allies. They always have been. Historically, China and Russia have always had common enemies and common threats against themselves, and also they would treat them in a very similar way. But at the same time, we can see that for the local market, China is also reminding different moments in the Chinese history when they were feeling more threatened by Soviets or Russians, and that many there is a reappearing topic of revisionism against Russian Far East territories, which is a very interesting topic, and this is very strongly, on the other hand, underplayed within Russian media, where you can listen to many different and very varied sources, which in the Western world would be rather unbelievable to have them speak with one voice, but here apparently is either they really do think this way, or they're somehow coerced to present this way, that China is not in any way any threat, and very rarely we can find sources like for local Siberian or Far Eastern media for the local Russian market, where you can sometimes see stories of Chinese takeovers of businesses, Chinese takeovers of some important natural resources, like a very famous story that was actually at some point even presented on the federal level within Russian Federation. It's famous Chinese takeover of Baikal water supply. But that's one story, and it was recently again underplayed. Although it's interesting that on local level there is something going on, but on the federal level I hear a lot of sinologists from Russia saying that no, there is no threat, that's his whole myth. I think the most famous representation of Chinese threat was a very famous program presented by Nikita Mikhalkov on his Besagon channel, that was actually showing how vulnerable Far East territories of Russia are to a Chinese eventual takeover. It's a fascinating program. It has been deleted later, and now Besagon, I think, was banned from YouTube, so it will be difficult to find. But he actually blow by blow shows the possibility of Chinese takeover with, as we know now, even more weakened Far East part of Russia may present itself to the Chinese. I don't know. Nikita Mikhalkov is not saying things like that anymore. Probably there is some other directive from the top that we can only evoke on the basis of what he says, and he's concentrating on fighting with foreign agents within Russian Federation, fighting with Western Europe and America, and negatively describing them in the media. There is always a very strong fight against imagined gay threat, Muslim threat, immigrant threat, and of course the divisive role of United States within Eastern Europe, that Eastern Europe of course would, according to those people, the people would like Russia to control and pacify everything, but America is poisoning with its toxic presence practically entire post-Soviet space. And yes, if we talk about Second World War, it's actually the basic myth of both countries. Modern Russia, which is very much reformed core of Soviet Union, and modern China, which has been created as the result of both Second World War and later on the communist nationalist conflict within Chinese society, is very much based on based mythologically, like the discourse and the chief political discourse is based on Second World War and revolution within China. Now, for the Russians, it is always Second World War on a European theater, with a very short mythologic and very short episode of fighting against Japan in the Far East, but the most important and self-aggrandizing moment for Russia is the moment of the win against Nazi Germany and the taking of Berlin. And usually when they refer to Second World War with this very famous slogan, we can repeat, можем повторить, we are talking about the Berlin, and they always say that the modern Europe is somehow resembles Nazi Germany, and they will need to denazify Europe, just as they do with Ukraine right now, and that denazification will culminate in taking over Berlin, Paris, and bombing away London. As if the Brits were not the ones that were the most hated aim also for the Germans. I don't know, it's somehow strange that Russians keep on repeating some talking points of Adolf Hitler. It must be a coincidence. Anyway, within Chinese realm, the main talking points are somehow different. For them, the most important part and the founding myth of the nation is opposition against Japan and Kuomintang, the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek party. So for them, the war ends in 1949, when the Chiang Kai-shek was finally driven out of mainland China and established himself in Taiwan. And of course, we do see some kind of a similar narrative to the Russian, but it's only because Russians helped. There was a great help. At that time there was a big friendship, and it's very often evoked in modern Chinese propaganda, and that great friendship also resulted in rebuilding of Chinese nation with minor but important Soviet help, and then if at the moment some, because this narrative is of course changing, sometimes swaying towards the greater role of Russia, but sometimes swaying to underline the great treachery of Russians that eventually gave up helping Chinese and turned against them, and then we have a little conflict on the border that may be presented as a heroic war. And funny, that little conflict on the border is presented very differently from Russian side. I mean, very differently within Russia, sometimes this way, sometimes that way. Same in China. In China it is usually underplayed, but if it is described, this is the victorious war against Russians that eventually had to give up some little islands on Amur River. From Russian point, this is a very divisive point, because Russia recently gave up those islands to Chinese without any bloodshed, but in a way betraying the Russian, or rather the Soviet victims of the war. I think that for the Russian side, underplaying the Chinese threat is a very important thing in order not to, I guess, not to scare local citizens. At the same time, for Chinese, actually the historic lands of China are repeated. Less in the official Chinese media, but more within the unofficial, but definitely controlled by central media, so not filtered out, not censored, nationalist circles on the Chinese social media. Well, as to the propaganda role, well, propaganda is always using very similar things, simplifying matters, simplifying problems, using every possible way to reach the target audience, and using a lot of simple, visible and hearable prompts. Of course, modern propaganda uses tools that were not available before. In Lenin times, that was probably cinema, and cinematic propaganda of the Soviet regime. In Hitler times, it was probably radio, and using radio and radio propaganda in the first days of his rule. In Soviet times, it was basically the television. And of course, in modern times, the greatest change and the new part of propaganda is social media, which is now available all over the world in almost uncontrolled form. The only controlled forms are in more totalitarian countries like Russia and China, where you've got a Great Firewall, when you've got a little bit more lacking control on the Russian side, and social media is used in different ways. I would say that Russians are playing with it much better, because they are trying to spread misinformation in many different ways that sometimes times are not discernible from the Western point of view and are not alerting people to themselves, to its presence by being very diverse. Whilst Chinese is sometimes still very, not only totalitarian, but very Northern Korean in taste, so it's readily noticeable and therefore a bit funny to the Western viewer, therefore not so effective. Although I have noticed that the TikTok way of showing propaganda, short, very clear communiques, is definitely working with younger people in the West, especially with the establishment of the Little Red Book as a viable service over in the US, and some TikTok algorithms that allow to show unsuspecting citizens more content with clear pro-Chinese message. Well, if we talk about the Great China Firewall, I have mentioned before, we have to realize that there is difference in Chinese propaganda as shown on the outside, although sometimes they do not change the scenarios. That's why for us it will seem a bit hoarse, a bit too in your face, therefore not convincing. But on the other hand, Great Chinese Firewall allows Chinese to almost completely filter out any independent voice within Chinese sphere. And as opposed, I guess, to Russia, because I don't really have the data to support it, but it is only anecdotal data, that within Chinese sphere, the VPN is used much less because people do not feel the necessity to venture outside the Great Chinese Firewall. Therefore, the Chinese information bubble is much more homogeneous and much more controlled by central authorities. Whereas in Russia, even now, YouTube is readily available, and with all the slowing down, other services that allow a lot of diversity of views are still available within Russia. So the situation of both countries is a bit different, although the Russian way of seeing things seems to be on the winning side within Russia, and it is kind of powerful also outside Russia. We see it winning some audiences in the Western world as well. And it is not always the fake news. Sometimes it's the interpretation of the actual news that is not discerned from being news, but only in the interpretation, and that is something that is very powerful in Western media, especially if it is made by the Western journalists. One of the very good examples would be Tucker Carlson, who by choosing who he is listening to and promoting certain points of view, as certain narratives that keep on repeating themselves without opposing even very evident lies, is, in my view, a Russian tool. But maybe I'm mistaken. Who knows? I might say that, the War and Propaganda is a very important seminar, and both Svetlana Romaniuk and Kuba Sadowski, my good friends, are very important in organizing this kind of seminar, and it's very important to see how do other countries view the war, and especially that war, as we can see from the recent events, is spreading further and further. So this kind of um, this kind of seminar, which is based on actually very many different research, from literature to media research to linguistic research and narrative research, and many angles from which we can analyze the way that propaganda works. It's a very multifaceted phenomenon. This, I think, is very important, and of course some things we will be only able to analyze later. It is always very difficult to see the immediately happening events, because we have this aberration that we see the close events only very, very fragmentarily. We do not have the full view. It's usually better to see it from the historic perspective, but I think it is important to try to analyze the events as they are happening. And that role of that war and propaganda seminar is very, very great for future reference, I guess. As to the question whether China and Russia are coordinating, I would not say so. I don't think so. I don't think they're coordinating the information policies, although they're using each other's policies to strengthen certain talking points that they're presenting then to outside and inside audiences. Like, for example, China will use every opportunity that Russian talking points give about Russian peaceful role, the peaceful liberation of regions, as if this is peaceful at all, about the local support for Russian aggression and so on. Those talking points would be repeated in China. Then China will strengthen other points that Russians are not showing, like basing on the Russian talking point about the danger that NATO poses on the Russian doorstep. China would talk about using Ukraine as a tool to endanger Russian sphere of influence, that Ukrainians are poor and used by the USA, that USA is fighting its conflict using Ukrainian blood. That's a very, very often used talking point, and that Ukraine does not realize how badly US is using them. And in view of recent actions by US government after the Trumpian takeover, there was some kind of change, but at the moment that Trump started imposing very strong anti-Chinese tariffs and strong policies, that rhetoric of a great Chino-American conflict came back, and now China is showing very often in its visual and mimetic discourse the situation that America is losing, and China is very much strengthening the meme that Trump in America is taco, Trump always chickens out, and so on. Whether it's true or not, I mean, whether America always chickens out is difficult to say, because Trumpian policy is very unstable. But again, from the linguistic point of view, the way that the Trumpian White House and the Trumpian politicians and Republicans are talking is also very unstable and multi-pronged. Sometimes you can see 2 or 3 warring factions presenting themselves in a very different ways. Especially you can notice that with the recent Musk-Trump conflict, which was an actual exercise in conflicting narratives also about China. So we do not know how would it develop, but again, as opposed to America being completely disarrayed in the way of using discourse. China and Russia would seem to coordinate because they're using similar talking points, and those points are sometimes taken over from each other in order to further the same most important point, which is warring with America. The biggest difference between Chinese and Russian talking points would be the attitude towards nuclear conflict, and generally against China is still using very often the rhetoric of non-intervention in the independent country, although little countries have less rights in Chinese view. So that is also not always integrated within the Chinese viewpoint. Well, in modern times it will be difficult to say how to strengthen your own information safety. I think the biggest information safety is using your brain, not these information patterns and discourse patterns, because patterns are things that reappear, and I wouldn't say that patterns are always a lie, but patterns like certain talking points may often use different facts to support them. And if you see similar pattern reappearing all over again with different facts supporting it, especially with those facts being difficult to trace, I would say that maybe that talking point may be a propaganda pattern. But again, sometimes I can trace this kind of patterns always. Also in our Polish talking points, we have some talking points that are important. Even for me personally, even though that sometimes they may seem anti-Ukrainian, since my family is still related to Lvov. My father was a repatriate from Lvov. There are certain talking points that are present in Polish information space that would be painful to discuss. But I think that avoiding them and glossing them over, and even worse, using them instead of discussing them, that would be the wrong thing. And again, using something as a as a tool to hit you instead of discussing the point is one of the characteristic features of propaganda and discourse war. So I would gladly, I know this is all painful, but I would gladly see the same openness on the Ukrainian side. I'm afraid that, for example, the question of language, and one of the reasons that I'm using English now, I think that this question is very painful on the Ukrainian side, and very often it has been used as a talking point by Russian propaganda or by Ukrainian counter-propaganda. And I think that would be very important not to allow war to influence the discourse. It's extremely difficult. I guess it's hard, and for me myself, speaking a lot of Russian in my life, I sometimes feel it painful when I hear Russian now. But on the other hand, we really need to realize that divorcing language from the war that we have now would be the excellent tool taken away from Russia propaganda toolbox. I always remind Russians that, yeah, Irish people speak English, but they still were able to shrug off and create the independent Republic of Ireland, even using English. The language does not have to be the defining feature of the nation, even though rationally that is very good that countries promote their own language. But I find this as a very dangerous tool as well, because the language conflict very often can cause then discrimination of one or more languages, and that will cause resentment and strengthen the Russian toolbox. I don't know whether I'm making myself clear, but we always have to look at the talking points and see what are the facts behind them. And sometimes, as I can understand that now it's happening, we can give up certain talking points. But for me, since I strongly believe in the freedom of expression, it may be choice to give up certain talking points, but it's never a good choice. Discuss. Do not use talking points as bashing tools. That will be much better. And think. That will be the information safety that I'd love. Yeah, the question about China and Sun Tzu is kind of reappearing. It's kind of defining the theoretical Chinese approach to conflict, but I'm not sure whether it's not some kind of a myth. I would say that maybe we should read more Deng Xiaoping in order to understand the modern Chinese approach to things, and of course Xi Jinping. I know that's very propagandistic, and a lot of slogan is in the Xi Jinping's works, but analyzing it, looking through it, may give people the idea in which direction China wants people to look, in which direction China perhaps will go, and what's in the future. I always remember reading in Deng Xiaoping works that China did not go through developed capitalist society. Therefore, China needs to encourage foreign investments in order to develop the capital that then the country can take over and make a real communist society. I don't know, maybe it will happen eventually. I'm not sure. But it is good to take a look at the way that China wants to present itself. Sun Tzu is an ancient thing, very good stratagems, very interesting for Chinese philosophy, but it is not everything that China has in its strategic toolbox. Not only philosophical, but also the way that strategy will work. So I think there is much more to China than just Sun Tzu. There is more strategic thinking on Chinese side, and some of it is still available online, especially for people with education in Chinese. There is more and more such people. There is Ukrainian Association of Sinologists, Українська асоціація китаєзнавців, and you should cooperate with them, you should ask them to advise you, and you always should carefully look how countries are presenting themselves, especially in central media, especially in countries where you have such a total control of social media as in China or in Russia. Those are important things that we should take a look at. And thank you for having me. Goodbye.